In the 1881 edition of his Life and Times, Frederick Douglass wrote about the living condition when he was a child on a plantation in Maryland. It was the boast of slaveholders that their slaves enjoyed more of the physical comforts of life than the peasantry of any country in the world. My experience contradicts this. The men and the women slaves on Colonel Lloyd's farm received as their monthly allowance of food 8 pounds of pickled pork or its equivalent in fish. The pork was often tainted, and the fish were of the poorest quality. With their pork or fish, they had given them 1 bushel of Indian meal, unbolted, of which quite 15% was more fit for pigs than for men. With this, 1 pint of salt was given, and this was the entire monthly allowance for a full-grown slave, working constantly in the open field from morning till night every day in the month except Sunday. There is no kind of work which really requires a better supply of food to prevent physical exhaustion than the field work of a slave. In the 1849 edition, he had been briefer but more descriptive. Our food was coarse cornmeal, boiled. This was called mush. It was put into a large wooden tray or trough and set down upon the ground. The children were then called, like so many pigs, and like so many pigs they would come and devour the mush, some with oyster shells, others with pieces of shingle, some with naked hands, none with spoons. He that ate fastest got most. He that was strongest secured the best place, and few left the trough satisfied. Historical documents like these can teach us about the conditions of the past, but historical archaeology and the study of material culture, of the things left behind by people, can add to these understandings. Here in the anthropology collections, we have a small collection of artifacts from a slave cabin on Cumberland Island, Georgia, that was excavated in the late 1960s by a crew led by Cornell archaeologist Bob Ascher and University of Florida archaeologist Charles Fairbanks. This was one of the first archaeological studies of a slave-related site in the United States, and several of the pieces recovered are related to food. These include a small iron kettle, which could have been used for cooking the cornmeal mush mentioned by Douglass, the origins of the grits still eaten throughout the South today, as well as for cooking other dishes like stews. Also recovered was a small and heavily used piece of flint called a strike-a-light, used to start fires by striking against a piece of steel to cause sparks. There was 1 large fragmentary bone recovered, originally identified as part of the pelvis of a pig, but restudied by our faunal archaeologist Professor Narissa Russell and re-identified as cow or steer. Clearly seen there are coarse butchering marks caused by chopping, as with a machete or a hatchet. This is precisely the sort of bone we'd expect to find in this context, not what is considered a first-choice cut of meat, but the tougher, bonier, more sinewy portions. The bones left over from cooking also could serve as raw material to make buttons, like the 3 examples to the right here that were recovered from this cabin. Many plantations had a button maker, as materials like that could be made on site meant money that didn't have to be spent to buy buttons. But commercially made metal buttons, like the one at left here, are also found on slave sites, probably obtained as hand-me-downs from the plantation house. There also were a number of small sherds of broken ceramic tablewares, which may have been discarded from the plantation when they broke. These include fragments of a very common tableware of the period, blue shell-edged pearlware, which would have looked like this platter when complete, and a striped form called annular pearlware for the rings, typically forms like mugs and cups, or bowls like this complete example. Also recovered during the excavation were a number of pieces of dark green bottle glass, which may relate to another practice that Douglass described. The days between Christmas Day and New Year's were allowed the slaves as holidays. During these days, all regular work was suspended, and there was nothing to do but to keep fires and look after the stock. We regarded this time as our own by the grace of our masters, and we therefore used it or abused it as we pleased. Those who had families at a distance were expected to visit them and spend with them the entire week. The younger slaves, or the unmarried ones, were expected to see to the cattle and to attend to incidental duties at home. The holidays were variously spent. The sober, thinking, industrious ones would employ themselves in manufacturing corn brooms, mats, horse collars, and baskets, and some of these were very well made. Another class spent their time in hunting possums, coons, rabbits, and other game. But the majority spent the holidays in sports, ball playing, wrestling, boxing, running foot races, dancing, and drinking whiskey. And this latter mode was generally most agreeable to their masters. The holidays are part and parcel of the gross fraud, wrong, and inhumanity of slavery. They are professedly a custom established by the benevolence of the slaveholders, but I undertake to say it is the result of selfishness and one of the grossest frauds committed upon the downtrodden slave. They do not give the slaves this time because they would not like to have their work during its continuance, but because they know it would be unsafe to deprive them of it. This will be seen by the fact that the slaveholders like to have their slaves spend those days just in such a manner as to make them as glad of their ending as of their beginning. Their object seems to be to disgust their slaves with freedom by plunging them into the lowest depths of dissipation. For instance, the slaveholders not only like to see the slave drink of his own accord, but will adopt various plans to make him drunk. One plan is to make bets on their slaves as to who can drink the most whiskey without getting drunk, and in this way they succeed in getting whole multitudes to drink to excess. It was about as well to be a slave to master as to be a slave to whiskey and rum. When the slave was drunk, the slaveholder had no fear that he would plan an insurrection, no fear that he would escape to the north. It was the sober, thoughtful slave who was dangerous and who needed the vigilance of his master to keep him a slave. The narratives of people who themselves experienced the life of slavery are powerful tools for understanding those historical processes. But the humble artifacts preserved through archaeological work also contribute by providing a tangible physical record of those lives.